Access denied, a military revenge story. The corridor outside the server bay runs colder than the rest of the building, by design. 61 degrees, always, so the machines don't choke on their own heat. I've walked it 1,000 times without noticing the temperature. I noticed it that night. Green LEDs ran down both walls in a long, even pulse, the heartbeat of 100 servers breathing behind steel. Somewhere above the ceiling tiles, a bank of intake fans held one continuous note, a sound with no beginning and no end. The kind of white noise you stop hearing after your first month on the job, and then suddenly hear again the moment something in the room is wrong. And under that note, closer, was another sound. Breathing. Fast. Not mine. My father stood at the biometric panel with his hand still raised, close enough to my face that I could see the tremor in it, not fear. I'd realize later. But the particular tremor of a 63-year-old body running on adrenaline it hadn't needed in over a decade. 3 feet away, the reader's screen glowed a flat, patient red. It had already made its decision. He hadn't made his yet. "Step back from the panel, Colonel," I said. 6 words. I didn't raise my voice. I never do. That's not restraint. Restraint implies I'm holding something back, biting down on some larger reaction. This was just the truth, delivered at its normal weight, the same weight I'd use to call out a system fault to a room full of analysts at 3 in the afternoon. I used his own rank when I said it, not mine. He'd made full colonel too, 1 war before me, and some part of me needed him to hear it as fact, not courtesy. He didn't step back. His hand came the rest of the way. "I want to tell you how a 31-year veteran of Army military intelligence, a man who once ran human source networks across 3 hostile provinces without losing an asset, ended up throwing his open palm at his own daughter's face in a sensitive compartmented information facility at 2 in the morning. But to understand how we got to that hallway, you have to go back 6 days, to a Tuesday that felt like every other Tuesday, and a dinner table that still had linen napkins, folded the way my mother used to fold them, because some habits are the only apology a man like him knows how to make, and he's been making that same apology to an empty chair for 6 years. 6 days earlier, none of this had a name yet. It was just a Tuesday. My name is Rachel Callahan. I hold the rank of Colonel, United States Army, and I run the Joint Cyber Defense Operations Center out of a windowless building at Fort Meade that most of my neighbors think is a data storage facility for the Census Bureau. I let them think that. It's easier than the truth, which is that I am responsible for the digital perimeter around some of the most sensitive intelligence infrastructure this country owns, the systems that never get names in the news, the ones that only become visible on the one day they fail. That Tuesday started the way most of my days start. Badge at the outer gate, biometric at the inner door, badge again at the elevator bank. 3 separate systems that don't trust each other and were never designed to. Inside, the operations floor runs on white light and low voices. 40 analysts spread across curved workstations, each one watching a slice of a network too large for any single human being to hold in their head at once. I've spent my whole career learning to read that floor the way an infantry officer reads terrain, where the noise is normal and where it isn't. Around 0900, a junior analyst named Ferris flagged a login attempt outside normal working hours on a dormant contractor credential, an access badge that had belonged to a vendor whose contract ended 2 years earlier and should have been purged from the system entirely, except that purging credentials at scale is the kind housekeeping that always loses to the next emergency. 3 seconds of access, then nothing. A door tried and let go. I looked at it for exactly as long as it takes to decide something isn't urgent, and then I moved on, because that morning I had 11 other things that seemed to matter more: a budget review, a staffing shortfall on the night shift, a vulnerability report from an outside auditor that needed a response by end of day. I want to be honest about that moment, because it's the only real mistake I made in this whole story, and I made it before any of the rest of it started. I saw the door move. I didn't ask who was testing the handle. Copy that. Lock it and log it, I told Ferris. And that was the whole conversation. Standard procedure. File it, watch it, move forward. In a building like mine, you get 100 small anomalies a week, and 99 of them are nothing a misconfigured script, a contractor who forgot to log off, a test running somewhere it shouldn't. You learn to triage. You don't always learn, until much later, which one was the exception. At 17:30, my phone buzzed with a text from my father. Dinner tonight. Don't be late, no question mark. There never is with him. Walter Callahan doesn't ask things, he schedules them, and waits to see if you show up on time. The way he once scheduled contact windows with sources who didn't get a vote either. I showed up, I always show up. That's its own kind of flaw, and it took me most of this story to understand that clearly that showing up out of love and showing up out of obligation can look identical from the outside and feel entirely different on the inside. And that I had stopped being able to tell which one I was doing a long time before that Tuesday. I didn't know it yet, but somewhere behind me, a clock had already started running. My father's house still smells like the house I grew up in, furniture polish, old paper, and underneath it, faintly, my mother's perfume from a bottle that's been empty for 6 years, but that he still keeps on her dresser. Because throwing it away would mean admitting something he isn't ready to admit. The dining room has a grandfather clock in the corner that he wound every Sunday of my childhood, and it was ticking that night with the same flat, patient rhythm it's kept since before I was born. Candlelight, the smell of a roasted bird and rosemary. Warm light pooling yellow across a tablecloth my mother had ironed 100 times. I'd come straight from a building where the light is always white and always the same, and the contrast hit me the way it always does at his house, like stepping out of a walk-in freezer into a kitchen mid-dinner service. My hands were still cold from the parking garage. The room wasn't. I remember flexing my fingers under the table, waiting for them to catch up to the temperature around them. He poured wine for both of us without asking, another scheduling decision disguised as hospitality. "How's the computer business?" he said. He says computer business the way other men say that phase you're going through. 31 years of tradecraft, dead drops in human sources and rooms where the wrong word could cost a man everything, and to him, what I do is data entry with better air conditioning. "It's the same business it was last month," I said. "Bigger scope, bandwidth." He said it with a small private smile like a joke only he understood. "In my day you read a man's face across a table. You can't read a firewall, Rachel." I let that sit. Arguing with my father about the nature of modern warfare was a losing proposition before I was born, and it hasn't improved with age. I've watched him say some version of that sentence to 3 different generals at 3 different retirement dinners. And every time, the room laughs, because it's a good line. And because nobody at those dinners has to live with what costs the person sitting across from him. He asked about David. He always asks about David at that way, dropped in sideways, like it's incidental, when it never is. My husband has been dead 4 years. Captain David Reyes, Army Special Forces, lost in a compound outside a city I'm not permitted to name in a report I helped write the classification guidance for. My father brings him up the way another man might bring up a debt somebody owes him. Not cruelly, not in his telling of it. He'd call it keeping her honest. I call it the oldest lever he has, and the one he still reaches for first. David used to say you were the toughest person in any building you walked into, he said, refilling a glass I hadn't finished. I wonder what he'd think of you locking doors on your own father. I hadn't locked any doors yet. That sentence would turn out to be a rehearsal, though I didn't know it at the time. I only knew that my jaw had tightened, and that I'd said nothing, because saying nothing was easier than explaining, again, that grief doesn't owe anyone leverage. "Bree still with your unit?" he asked, apropos of nothing, cutting into the bird. Sokolov. Good soldier. She used to send me a card every Christmas, back when she thought I still mattered to people like her. She still sends the card, I said. You still matter to people, Dad. Just not in the way you used to. He let that pass without comment, which from him was its own kind of answer. Then, almost as an afterthought, over the last of the wine, in the same tone he might have used to ask whether I'd remember to renew my car registration, he circled back to something else entirely. You still hold clearance for facility access, don't you? Badge privileges, all that. I still hold clearance, I said. That hasn't changed. He nodded like he'd confirmed something on a checklist and reached across the table to take my empty wine glass before I could reach it myself, a small, fatherly gesture, the kind you'd see in any home in this country on any given Tuesday. He carried it to the sink himself, rinsed it under the tap, dried the stem with a dish towel, set it upright in the rack. I remember thinking, in the specific small way you remember unimportant things, that it was a nice thing for him to do, a rare and simple kindness from a man who didn't often offer them without a reason attached. I didn't think about it again for 5 more days. I've replayed it 100 times since. What I'm about to tell you next, I didn't witness. I pieced it together afterward from a hard drive Army Criminal Investigation Division, pulled from a laptop, from statements taken during a formal Article 32 hearing, from a storage unit in Elkridge, Maryland, full of boxes that told a clearer story than my father ever told out loud. I'm relaying it to you the way I came to understand it, as evidence, not as guesswork. That distinction mattered to me more than almost anything else once this was over. My father's consulting office sat above a defunct dry cleaner in a strip mall off Route 1, one of 1,000 small firms that exist in its gray space between retired intelligence officers and the private contracts that court them. The overhead fluorescents buzzed and stuttered, one tube dying by inches, throwing a faint strobe over a desk stacked with unpaid invoices he kept meaning to reorganize. On the wall behind him hung a photograph from his commissioning ceremony, 31 years old in that image, jaw set, certain of everything he was about to become. Dust had settled on the frame in a way that suggested nobody had really looked at it in a long time. A man named Grant Doyle sat across from him that Wednesday morning, a defense broker in his 50s with a haircut too expensive for the rest of him. The kind of man who describes himself as a strategic access consultant because the honest job title doesn't fit on a business card. Doyle's firm was 6 weeks from insolvency, so quietly was my father's. Both men were running out of the same thing, people still willing to trust them with anything that mattered. The Petrov account needs a data package by Friday, Doyle said. Not analysis. Raw feed. Something with teeth in it, something that proves we still have reach. That feed doesn't exist outside a SCIF, my father said. You know someone with a SCIF. Doyle let that sentence sit on the desk between them, the way a good recruiter lets an offer sit, no pressure, just gravity. My father had used that same silence himself, 100 times, on the other side of 100 foreign tables. There are lines even I don't cross, my father said, though the boxes CID investigators later pulled from his storage unit suggested he'd already started sketching where the new line might sit. Nobody's asking you to cross a line, Doyle said. I'm asking you to open a door you already have a key to. Family key. Nothing about that is a crime. My father didn't answer right away. That silence is the part I've had to sit with the longest 31 years of believing himself the most capable man in any room, watching his own daughter build the same kind of capability in a language he'd never learned, in a building he couldn't enter without her permission. She won't report her own father, he finally said. He wasn't wrong about the reporting. He was wrong about everything else. By Thursday afternoon, Ferris's small anomaly had grown teeth of its own. My deputy, Master Sergeant Bree Sokolov, found me in my office with a laptop already open, the posture of someone who'd been sitting with bad news for 20 minutes deciding how to deliver it without alarming the whole floor. Sokolov and I have worked together for 6 years, through 2 duty stations and 1 deployment. She reads me the way I read a network diagram, which is to say completely, and without needing me to say much first. "Ma'am, that dormant contractor badge from Tuesday," she said. "It pinged the visitor gate reader at 0640 this morning. Denied expired credential, but somebody physically presented it in person." "Pull the visitor log," I said. "Cross it against gate camera." She already had. On the screen, my father, standing at the visitor processing window at 0900, a man I didn't recognize beside him, expensive haircut, patient posture, the specific stillness of someone used to waiting outside rooms he isn't allowed into. The sign-in sheet listed the visit reason in my father's own handwriting: family anniversary of son-in-law's memorial service. David's memorial anniversary wasn't for another 5 months. My father knew that. I knew that. Sokolov, reading my face, didn't say anything at all, just turned the laptop a few degrees so I could see the timestamp more clearly, as if the numbers themselves might soften what they meant. I walked down to the gate myself, rather than send someone in my place. Heat waited outside the fence line, thick and bright off the asphalt, the kind of late-season heat that makes the guard shack shimmer at the edges. The moment I crossed the threshold into the vestibule, the air conditioning dropped 15 degrees in 3 steps, the specific cold of a building that spends more on climate control than most embassies spend on security. My father stood on the visitor side of the turnstile in a blazer he'd pressed for the occasions, the crease still sharp along the sleeve. Doyle stood a half step behind him, hands folded, a man content to let someone else do the talking while he watched everything. Every analyst in the outer bullpen could see the glass. I felt that before I felt anything else, the specific, cold awareness of an audience, of 40 people who reported to me watching to see what I'd do with my own father standing at the fence line. "Escort him to visitor processing," I told the gate NCO, keeping my voice at the same flat register I use for everything on that floor. "Not past this line." My father's face didn't fall the way I expected it to. It settled, instead, into something almost satisfied, the expression of a man who has just watched a door confirm exactly what he suspected it would do. Evidence collected rather than a plan defeated. "In front of your own people," he said, quiet enough that only I could hear it over the turnstile's mechanical hum. "That's who you are now." I didn't answer that. I signed the incident log, initialed the visitor denial, and went back upstairs, and told myself the matter was closed. It wasn't. It was, I'd later realize, exactly the reaction he'd been testing for proof that I would rather humiliate him than let him near the building, which meant, in the arithmetic he was running, that the building was worth more to him than I understood. Sokolov caught the second anomaly before I did the same badge that had been denied at the gate, had somehow, 4 hours later, been represented and accepted at a side data center entrance under a temporary visitor credential nobody remembered issuing. Not our sensitive systems. A decoy segment deliberately soft, that Sokolov had quietly stood up the moment she saw the first denial, a shadow directory built to look, to anyone probing from outside, exactly like the real thing. Right down to the file names and the fake latency. "Give it a door that looks open," I'd told her that afternoon. "Watch who walks through." Someone walked through it that same night. The access logs showed a full, unhurried crawl of the decoy directory, careful, methodical, the movements of a man who believed himself unwatched and who was, for once in this story, entirely wrong about that. Sokolov found me in the parking structure as I was leaving, phone already in her hand, her breath fogging faintly in the structure's shadowed cold, even though the evening outside was still warm. "He just took the bait," she said. "It's your father's badge." Whoever's behind it moved like they'd done this kind of work before. Just not this kind of network. I stood there a long moment, keys in my hand, the concrete pillar beside me radiating the day's leftover heat, while the wind funneling through the structure carried the first real chill of the coming season. Warm concrete at my back, cold air on my face. I remember noticing both at once, the way you notice things when your mind needs somewhere else to go besides the obvious. 24 hours, I said, then it's out of my hands. Sokolov didn't argue, though her silence had weight to it. She should have argued. That was the flaw in me talking, not the officer, the part of me that still, after everything, wanted to give my father one more door he could walk back out of on his own, without an investigator standing on the other side of it. Before she left that night, she pulled up the decoy directory one more time, scrolling through the fake file tree she'd built in an afternoon, folder names close enough to the real thing to pass a glance, far enough off to mean nothing to anyone who actually opened them. It's not much, she said half to herself, but it'll hold whoever's curious long enough to get a clean picture of their hands. That's all I need, I told her, a clean picture. I meant it clinically, the way I mean most things on that floor. I didn't yet know whose hands I was asking for a clean picture of. Some part of me, I think, already suspected, and had simply decided not to look at that thought directly, the way you avoid looking straight into a light that's already too bright. That same evening, in my kitchen, my daughter Maya sat at the counter with her homework spread out under the warm cone of the reading lamp, 15 years old and carrying an expression I didn't recognize on her face until she finally spoke. Chewing the end of her pencil the way she does when she's deciding whether something is worth saying out loud. "Grandpa called me today," she said, not looking up from her textbook. "He asked when your night shifts are. Said he wanted to surprise you with something for the anniversary." I felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the kitchen, which was warm, golden, ordinary, the exact opposite of the building I'd just come from. "What did you tell him?" "I told him Tuesdays and Thursdays," Maya said, finally looking up. "Is that bad?" He said it was for a good thing. I didn't answer her right away, because I was doing the math, and the math came out ugly. Tuesday, Thursday, the same nights the decoy directory had logged its crawl. I want to be clear about something, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. My daughter did nothing wrong. She answered her grandfather a true and ordinary question, the way any 15-year-old would answer a grandparent who'd never once in her whole life given her a reason to doubt him. What I stayed angry about, long after the rest of it resolved, is that a man used a child as a door, the same way he'd used a dinner and a wine glass and a made-up memorial date. Every entrance he tried through someone who loved him without condition. "It's not bad," I told her, and meant it, and made a note, quietly, to have a very different conversation with her later, once I understood the shape of what I was dealing with. She went back to her textbook, satisfied, the particular relief of a teenager who's just confirmed she hasn't done anything wrong. I sat with her a while longer than I needed to that night, watching her work through a chemistry problem under that warm reading lamp, thinking about how easy it is for someone to walk through the people who love you instead of the walls built to stop them, and how none of my systems, for all their sensors and lockdowns, had a protocol for that. 3 days went past before I moved again. I told myself I was giving Sokolov time to corroborate the decoy logs properly, and giving my father room to undo what he'd started on his own, without anyone standing on the other side of the door to make him do it. That was the truer failure, and I knew it even while I was making it. By Sunday evening, neither of us had used the time the way we should have. I called him instead of escalating through Sokolov's chain of command, and that was the mistake, with my name on it, not a crime, not a cover-up, just a soldier's daughter, giving her father one more warning than procedure required. Because some part of me still believed a phone call could do what an investigation would otherwise have to. "I know like him kept strange things. I know what you did with the visitor credential," I said, standing in my own driveway, in the dark, the neighborhood quiet enough that I could hear the clock on my own kitchen wall through the open window. I know about the directory. Silence on the line, long enough that I heard, faintly, the grandfather clock ticking somewhere behind him, that same rhythm that had kept time over every dinner of my childhood. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, which was its own kind of answer, delivered in the same even voice he used, to use debriefing sources who'd started to lie to him. "Don't make me choose the badge over the blood," I said. "That's not a choice you get to frame," he said. "Raised you. I don't answer to a door you built." He hung up first. I stood in the driveway a long time after that, the porch light the only warm point of light on the whole street, and understood, with the specific clarity that only comes too late, that I hadn't given him a chance to stop. I'd given him a deadline to beat. He spent that Sunday night in his garage, under a single work lamp, with a wine glass in a plastic evidence bag on the workbench, in front of him the one he'd rinsed himself in my kitchen the previous Tuesday, dried the stem, set in the rack to dry. And, I'd later learn, lifted back out before it ever went anywhere near the dishwasher. A print doesn't need much. A glass, a lift kit ordered off a hobbyist forum meant for locksmiths and amateur magicians, not intelligence officers, the kind of thing that works. Sometimes, against a consumer doorknob and fails, almost always. Against anything built to detect a living pulse underneath the ridge pattern. My father had spent 3 decades running human networks. He had never once, in 31 years, needed to understand liveness detection. He was about to learn what it was the hard way, in a hallway with cameras in every corner. He'd rehearsed the excuse he'd give if a guard stopped him short of the SCIF door, a forgotten personal item, a sentimental keepsake of David's he'd supposedly left behind on a visit years earlier. Something no guard would want to be the one to deny a grieving father-in-law. It was a good cover story. It was the kind of cover story that had kept him alive in 3 hostile provinces. It never once occurred to him that the next checkpoint wouldn't be a guard he could talk to at all. Just a strip of silicone pressed against a sensor that doesn't listen to reasons. Doyle waited outside in the car, engine running, the headlights carving 2 cones of white through the dark of the cul-de-sac, radio murmuring low. A man checking his watch every few minutes the way people do when they've already decided. A plan is running late before it's even started. "1 glass," my father said to no one, holding the finished mold up to the work lamp, and turning it in the light like a man reading a photograph for a face he half remembered. 1 print, 1 door. He believed, I think, that this was still tradecraft, that a lifted print and a rehearsed excuse were the same tools he'd always used, just aimed at a different kind of target. He didn't understand, and wouldn't have believed me if I'd told him, standing right there in that garage, that the target had changed shape entirely. There was no source to recruit at that door, no human weakness to work with patience and time. There was only a sensor, indifferent to rank and history alike, and the sensor doesn't do sentiment. The gate log shows he badged into the outer facility at 01:48 on Monday morning 6 days, almost to the hour. After a Tuesday dinner neither of us had known, was a countdown using credentials that should have been flagged the moment they were re-presented. They weren't, because Sokolov had deliberately left that one path, soft, a lit hallway leading nowhere real, so that whoever walked it would walk it in full view of a camera he didn't know was watching every step. He crossed 2 checkpoints that felt, to him, like small victories, each one confirming he still had the instincts that had carried him through 31 years of fieldwork. He reached the SCIF corridor at 01:59. He had, by his own math, 1 minute to spare before the shift change he'd clocked from his last visit. I know all of this now because a system I designed told the truth about it later, second by second, with no opinion of its own to get in the way. That's the whole point of a system like that. It doesn't care whose father is standing in front of it, and it doesn't get tired, and it doesn't owe anyone the benefit of the doubt. There's a particular kind of confidence, that comes from 31 years of walking into rooms other people couldn't get into. And I think that confidence is what carried him those last 100 feet of hallway more than any real plan did. He'd spent a career reading the one variable that mattered in any room the person across from him: their fear, their price, their tell. He'd never had to read a sensor before. A sensor doesn't have a price. It doesn't have a tell. It has a threshold, and either you clear it or you don't, and no amount of 31 years changes which side of that line you land on. I was 3 miles away, asleep, when my phone lit up with an automated priority alert, not from Sokolov, but from the facility itself, the way it's built to do the instant someone attempts biometric access outside authorized parameters. The alert didn't have a name attached to it. It didn't need one. Systems like mine are built to treat every unauthorized attempt the same way, whether it's a foreign intrusion or a man who used to read my bedtime stories. I was in the car in 4 minutes, still in the clothes I'd fallen asleep in, running through the response protocol in my head the way I'd run it 100 times in tabletop exercises. Except this time the variable I couldn't model was my own name on the visitor log 5 days earlier, and what that would look like to an investigator with no context for any of it. I don't remember most of that drive. I remember the gate guard's face when I badged through faster than procedure technically allows, and I remember the specific ringing cold of the parking structure when I got there, and I remember running. My boots loud against concrete, in a building that's usually silent at that hour, my mind already splitting itself in two, one half racing to stop whatever was happening. The other half already building the report I'd have to file no matter how it ended. Which brings us back to the hallway. The reader's screen sat between us, small and patient, the words still glowing on it in flat red block letters: access denied. Biometric mismatch. My father stood in front of it with a strip of synthetic film still pressed against his index finger, and for 1 full second, neither of us said anything at all. The intake fans held their note above us unbothered. The green server lights kept their slow pulse down both walls, indifferent, the way machines are always indifferent to the worst nights of the people standing in front of them. I stepped past him to the panel and keyed in an override that locked the entire segment down to my authorization alone. It's a small motion. 4 keystrokes, maybe 5 seconds. It ends whatever conversation was still happening between a man and a door that had already made up its mind about him. He turned toward me the way a man turns when a door he has never once had refused to him closes in his face for the first time in his life, the particular disorientation of someone discovering, at 63, that the world has a room he can no longer talk his way into. "You'd lock this in front of your own father," he said. Not a question. "Step back from the panel, Colonel," I said again, because it was still true, and because I had run out of other things I was willing to say to him that night that hadn't already failed once over the phone. His arm came up. "I saw it the way you see something you've already braced for, without wanting to admit you'd braced for it, a shift of weight through the shoulder, the elbow rotating open, momentum committed a half second before it was still possible to stop. I turned my head into it, rather than away from it, which is what 11 years of hand-to-hand instruction teaches your body to do without asking permission from the rest of you. Redirecting the angle so the strike landed glancing along the jaw, rather than square across it. It still landed. My ear rang with a high, clean tone, and the cold of the cord suddenly felt very far away, replaced by a heat that started at my jaw and spread down into my neck. He drew the arm back for a second one. He never threw it. The corridor answered first. Overhead, the lighting shifted from white to a slow, saturating red, and a tone I'd only ever heard in drills sounded once, twice, a third time level 5 lockdown, automatic, unstoppable by anyone standing in that hallway, myself included. Every door on the segment sealed itself in the same half-second, with a soft mechanical thud that ran down the corridor like a held breath finally released. The cameras that had already been recording, since his first badge swipe, kept recording, the way they're built to, without needing either of us to ask them to. Lockdown is not a suggestion, I said. My jaw already ached around the words, my own voice sounding strange to me, farther away than it should have. It already logged your hand. He looked at the ceiling, then at the reader, then, last, at me, and something in his face changed in a way I don't think I'll ever fully describe to anyone who wasn't standing in that hallway. It wasn't shame, not yet. It was the specific look of a man doing math he should have done 6 days earlier, and arriving at an answer he couldn't argue with, no matter how many source networks he'd once run, or how many rooms he'd once talked his way out of. Federal security reached the segment within 90 seconds, the response time the system is built for, the entire reason Level 5 exists at all. 2 agents from the installation's protective service detail arrived first. Radios crackling, hands loose and ready at their sides out of procedure rather than any real doubt about the situation. Within the hour, investigators from Army Criminal Investigation Division and a liaison from the Counterintelligence Field Office had the corridor. Because unauthorized biometric spoofing inside a SCIF doesn't stay a family matter, no matter whose name is on the paperwork or whose retirement photo used to hang on a wall 2 floors up. They restrained him with flex cuffs in the Sally Port, under emergency lighting that had gone from red back to a harsh, sourceless white. He didn't fight it. 31 years of training doesn't leave a man just because the room he's standing in has turned against him. I have 31 years of clearance, he said, to the nearest agent, to the ceiling, to no one in particular, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I built rooms like this, sir, the agent said, not unkindly, writing something on a clipboard without looking up. This room built itself around the fact that you don't work here anymore. I stood at the far end of the Sally Port while they processed him, close enough to hear it, far enough that no one asked me to leave. Someone had brought me an ice pack for my jaw at some time without my noticing, and I held it there without really feeling the cold anymore. Watching a man I'd known my entire life get walked out of a building he'd once helped design the security philosophy for, decades before either of us had ever heard the word cyber attached to the word defense. They found Doyle idling outside the outer perimeter within the hour, and the financial trail behind him was already sitting on a federal server 2 states away by the time anyone thought to look for it, the emails, the wire transfer schedule. A shell contract with the Petrov account's name buried 3 subsidiaries deep. It took investigators 4 days to fully build a case my father had handed them, unknowingly, the moment his glove touched that reader. The Article 32 hearing took place 7 weeks later in a room with none of the theater people expect from military justice: fluorescent light, government carpet, a long table, and a panel of officers who had already read every page of the evidence log before anyone in the room said a word out loud. I testified for 11 minutes. The system testified for the rest of it, in timestamps and camera footage and a biometric mismatch report that didn't care how many decorations had once hung in my father's closet, or how many source networks he'd built before I was old enough to know what that meant. He was charged with conspiracy to commit unauthorized access to a national security system, and separately with assault, for the hand that never got its second swing. The retirement he'd built his whole later life around the pension, the clearance that let him walk into rooms like Doyle's and sound important. The photograph on the wall from a ceremony 31 years gone, all of it was gone with the finding against him. Sokolov testified after me, walking the panel through the decoy directory line by line, timestamp by timestamp, in the same flat procedural voice she uses on the operations floor. One of the panel members, a 1-star I didn't recognize, asked her at the end whether she'd had any hesitation building a trap for her own commander's father. "No, sir," she said. "The system doesn't know he's her father. I built it not to know that. That's the whole design." Nobody had a follow-up question after that. Doyle's firm folded within the month, His own case is still working through federal court as I tell you this, and from what I understand, it isn't going well for him either. The Petrov account, whatever it actually was, never received a single file. I didn't attend the sentencing. By then, I'd already given the story everything I owed it, and I understood, finally, the difference between the two kinds of showing up I'd spent so long confusing, the kind that protects the people who depend on you, and the kind that only ever protected him. 3 weeks after that, I stood in a conference room at Fort Meade in service dress, in front of a review board convened to close out the incident. And a 2-star general read a citation into the record about operational integrity and the successful defense of a national asset, using words I mostly didn't hear because I was thinking, of all things, about a wine glass drying in a rack. Sokolov stood along the back wall in her own dress uniform, and when the general shook my hand, I caught her eye over his shoulder, and she gave me the smallest nod. The kind two people give each other when they both know exactly how close a good outcome came to not happening. Ferris was there too, near the back, and I found him afterward in the hallway to tell him the second look had been mine to give, not his. He didn't say much back. I don't think he needed to. That evening I stood in my own kitchen instead, the warm afternoon light coming low and gold through the window over the sink, and I rinsed 2 glasses by hand, mine and Maya's, and set them both in the rack to dry, upright. The way you do when you intend to use them again, the way that means something different now than it used to. Maya sat at the counter, homework closed for the night, watching me with the particular attention of a 15-year-old trying to decide whether it's safe to ask the question she's been sitting on for 3 weeks. "Are you going to see him?" she asked. "Ever?" "I don't know yet," I told her, honestly, because that's the one thing I owed her more than comfort, more than a clean answer wrapped up neatly for her sake. Some doors stay locked. That's how you keep the ones you love safe. She nodded slowly, the way you nod at something you're still working out how to feel about, and reached for the towel to help me dry, and for a while neither of us said anything else. And the kitchen held that particular kind of quiet that isn't empty, just settled. What I keep coming back to, when I let myself think about the whole arc of it, isn't the hallway, or the cuffs, or even the hearing. It's the wine glass. A man spent 3 decades learning to read every room he ever walked into, and the one detail that undid him was the most ordinary object in my kitchen, a glass he rinsed himself, out of what looked, in the moment, exactly like love. I don't know how to hold both of those truths at once, that the gesture was real and the theft was real inside the same 5 seconds. I'm not sure I'm supposed to. I think some things you're just meant to carry unresolved, the way you carry a locked door, not because you've stopped caring what's behind it, but because caring is exactly why it has to stay locked. Outside, the evening was warm and ordinary, and somewhere 3 miles away a server room held its temperature at 61 degrees. Green lights pulsing in the dark, patient, exact. Keeping the only kind of promise that had never once, in this whole story, broken, and